Schwartz grew up in the Northeast and is a graduate of Harvard, where he majored in East Asian Studies. His first novel, Bicycle Days, was published in 1989, and it was followed by Claire Marvel and then Reservation Road. That novel was adapted into a film last year starring Joaquin Phoenix and Jennifer Connelly, and Schwartz did the screenplay. Now, such collisions between authors and Hollywood have led to some remarkable stories and clashes over the past decades. Think of William Faulkner, if you will, and it would be interesting to know of our authors' experiences, so perhaps during question time tonight. I hope all of you have seen or will take the time to see the beautiful exhibits in the lobby and up here on stage presented by Mingei World Arts, which is here in Decatur. They are a distributor and have a spectacular store. If you've never been in it, please go see them too. The presence of these kimonos, of course, is hardly accidental. The Commoner is set in and is all about Japan. It is a brilliant and compelling narrative of the secretive and quite cloistered life of the current empress of Japan, the first commoner to ascend to the chrysanthemum throne. It is a novel, but it is heavily washed in facts, and it is based on the true story of the woman who became the empress, sort of a desperate housewife, if you will. The novel has drawn high praise from critics. One calls it a unique and moving literary adventure, and others have likened it to memoirs of a geisha. The author is on a national tour, which is taking him to New York, which is where he makes his home, or almost, in Brooklyn, to Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and, of course, to the Georgia Center for the Book in Atlanta. Please join me tonight in welcoming our guest, John Burnham Schwartz.
Thanks. Thank you, Bill, for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm very glad to be here. I do want to thank all the efforts for, it's an incredible stage. It's actually, it's a little anxiety-making. It's so nice. But it's really beautiful, and I really appreciate the effort. It's doubly nice for me to be here. One of my teachers, one of my English teachers from boarding school, actually, lives about 5 minutes from here. He's one of my dearest friends, and so we never get to see each other enough. So coming here for me is not just a professional trip, but also a very happy personal trip, and so that's always nice. So as Bill spoke about in his introduction, this is a story, really, you could boil it down any number of ways, but it's the story, among other things, of a young woman who marries into a certain family. And so I thought, since that family is not a common family in any way, in fact, you could say that that family is not like any other family in the world, that I might talk a little bit first about the history of that family, to try and put in context as we go forward in the story what exactly it is we're talking about when we say that a certain woman married into a certain family. So this is, of course, the Japanese imperial family. And I should add, and this is in the age of YouTube, when, you know, anybody's actions, no matter how banal, might be on video the next morning. It is truly hard to imagine the simple fact that the Japanese imperial family, the members, the main members of that family, the emperor, the empress, the crown prince, the crown princess, that these people are literally permanently obscured as human beings from the public at large. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start with what's available about them. No fragments of letters that they ever wrote or received will ever be published or ever have been published. No letters themselves. No letters, and this is very much speaks to our culture, the kind of things where you send a letter and then one day if anything ever happens to you and makes you notable, that letter will make its way into the public sphere and be published. You can guarantee it. Nothing like that has ever happened in Japan regarding the members of the imperial family. Nothing that ever went out either, if anything ever went out, ever made its way into the public sphere and was then seen again. No unofficial photographs. No unofficial interviews off the cuff. No remarks. Nothing. No drawings, no doodles, no jokes, nothing. It is safe to say that nothing that marks any of these people as what we consider to be particular human beings, how anyone feels under any particular circumstance that happens to them, has ever gotten out. So that's something to keep in mind as we go back in this history and then go forward again. It is a very strange situation, but it is a situation that arises both before and after the need to make out of human beings pure symbols. Three-dimensional people cannot be symbols. They must be flattened first in some fashion. Okay, the family. So the Japanese imperial family and the culture at large traces its lineage back to the beginning of recorded time. Well, that's close to 1,600 years. That's the beginning of recorded time in Japan. Back beyond that, the family is also to some degree mythically traced, its origins, back into the sort of the murk of the rising of the earth out of the atmosphere, the rising of the sun goddess, among other things, Amaterasu Omikami, from this atmosphere over the land that would become Japan. Eventually, millennia and centuries later, from this sun goddess, the first emperor. Jump ahead a few centuries and you have the world of the Tale of Genji, 10th and 11th century Japan. That is a particularly long novel. It happens to really be the first novel ever written. If you've never read it, it is a story and many stories about the world of the court back then, a world which consisted of about 5,000 inhabitants who basically existed had an utterly separate existence from the rest of the people of Japan. It was back then, the court was in Kyoto. It was a world of poetry writing and secret affairs in the dark. They always seemed to be in the dark. In fact, I don't think they ever saw each other in the light. There were screens and robes and whatnot, and according to some of the portraits I've seen, maybe it's just as well that they never saw each other in the light. But that's for an HBO series, not for me to talk about. So this was the world for a while. Our next, I think, clearest picture of that world is probably a few hundred years later, in, let's say, 13th and 14th century Japan. There's a book called The Confessions of Lady Nijo, which was discovered about 50 or 60 years ago. That was a diary, essentially, written by Lady Nijo, who was a courtesan, you might say concubine as well, of a couple of different emperors, and whose fortunes rose and fall among a couple of different emperors over a number of years, ultimately falling so that she was exiled and she ended her days as a wandering nun. It gives us a certain window into the world at that time. All through these years, the emperor was then, as he really is again today, really mostly, almost entirely, a symbol of cultural and even, to some degree, racial purity of the country at large, of the existence of the country, of how the country came out of a world that, though there was a great deal of borrowing from China early on, in India and Korea, in religious structures and social and political structures, that nonetheless the emperor himself was a symbol of the indigenous, a symbol of the part of Japan that had always been and only come from Japan. But he was no more than a symbol. He had no power. There were warring factions, great families that were fighting each other for power during this time. And this basically carries us up into the 19th century. 1869, the Meiji Restoration, the reopening of Japan to the west, the coming of the black ships, as it's called. The black ships, of course, were American warships, Admiral Perry. Around this time, around Emperor Meiji, there was a small group of advisors around him who decided that the emperor, it was time that the emperor become something more than a symbol of purity, cultural and racial purity, that he in fact in some way speak back to the origins of that first emperor and in fact forge a closer relationship with the gods. And it was decided in some fashion that the emperor must become a god and cease to be a man. Now when I say God, it's not exactly what we mean here in the West by God, but it is a deity. It is not a man. And a new constitution was drawn up, the first constitution, in 1869. And the way that they managed to make the emperor become a god and make it seem as though, in fact, he had always been a god, even though he had not, was to meld the idea of his position and himself with that of the one indigenous religion in Japan, which is Shinto. They took Shinto and they made it into a state religion, a religion for the country, for everybody, although there were other religions. There was Buddhism, there was Christianity, and they made the emperor a part of Shinto. They made him sort of the high priest, if you will, of Shinto, and they made him into a god. Now, what is interesting to note is how quickly this idea of the emperor as god was absorbed and adopted in the country. I think it's safe to say that this would not have been possible in a country less insular and less homogeneous than Japan. But at any rate, it was very quickly, by the end of the 19th century, that the Japanese were fighting in the name of the emperor, which is to say they were fighting in the name of their god. This is the image, unfortunately, that is so strongly in the minds of many Westerners when they consider the Japanese at the end of the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century. The army fighting in the name of the emperor, who was not a man, but clearly something more than a man, a god. And they did fight. They fought the Chinese, they fought the Russians, they fought the Koreans, they fought the Chinese again, and then they were in World War II, which was the first battle, in fact, that they ended up losing. So here we are, the end of the war, 1946. Just to imagine how we have leapt from 1869, when the emperor had still been a man. In 1946, January, when the emperor got on the radio at MacArthur's demand, MacArthur, by the way, having decided not to try the emperor for war crimes, possibly hang him, but in fact to make him a part of his strategy to have the new American Constitution adopted throughout the country. The Constitution that would in fact do away with all titles of nobility and all ideas that anybody could be a god and not a man. So the emperor, in January of 1946, the Japanese had surrendered some months before, gets on the radio, and he announces, as he must, to his people that he is in fact not a god, but a man. Had you been in Japan then, and I've spoken to a couple of people who were, you would have seen at any number of places in the country during this radio broadcast people falling to their knees in shock. The greatest shock for some was the emperor's voice. They'd never heard it before. In fact, some of them didn't even understand that he had possessed a voice like people, like other people. They'd never heard it and didn't even imagine it. And when he did in fact speak, what you heard was not Japanese as most people understood it, but a convoluted court Japanese, which was incredibly difficult for most people to understand. And when, in the subsequent years, he went out on these tours that were organized by MacArthur, sent all over the country, these Junko tours, to meet the people, what they found was a very small man with thick glasses and a dark suit and a felt hat who did not actually know the names for many common objects in the world, had never seen most of the objects or done most of the simple things that we consider to be absolutely basic in the realm of living. So what does this have to do with our empress and crown princess as they are? Well, give you some idea, that man in 1946 who got on the radio to declare that he was not a god but a man, that man was Hirohito. So Hirohito had been a god for a good part of his life, most of his life, his entire life, I think it's safe to say. He had been a god, not a man. And then in 1946, he became a man. That man, 13 years later, among other things, became the father-in-law of Empress Michiko, who was then crown princess. Michiko Shoda, who had grown up in Tokyo to a privileged, but I think it's safe to say, if the word means much, normal family. Normal meaning in this case simply that her childhood was much like any of ours. Parents, friends, school, songs, crushes, jokes, mistakes, spontaneous moments. Never knowing that she would, in 1959, marry the crown prince and thus enter into a world where only 13 years before her father-in-law had been a god. So she marries in, and not long after, it's an incredibly enormous ceremony, cheered by many, the idea that this was a love match, unheard of, and I think it probably was a love match. Incredible procession through the streets. She marries in, and not long afterwards, maybe 2 years, she gives birth to a boy, which is what she's supposed to do. In fact, you could say it's all she's supposed to do, all they're supposed to do. Nonetheless, she is a commoner, meaning from a aristocratic family. Although the titles of all the nobles who worked in the court, the 1,000 or 2,000 aristocratic families who worked underneath the emperor and empress, making everything possible and ruling the court life, although their titles were abolished by the new constitution, nonetheless they were still there. And they worked for the empress, and they were the ladies in waiting. And the empress herself was one of these people, quite clearly. And they all looked down upon the new crown princess, who was a commoner. And they were very mean to her, and they were, in fact, you might say, they were crushing in many ways. This is outside of all the strictures and the requirements of behavior and the words that are put in your mouth that are not yours. At any rate, we'll never know exactly what she felt, this crown princess, because, as I said before, we'll never know what any of them felt or feel exactly. She suffered a breakdown. She lost her voice for about 7 months, completely. This is something that is certainly echoed in the book. She recovered. Again, we don't really know. She had other children, and in some fashion, in some way that we don't know, she formed a relationship with her situation. Whether it was about being resigned or some form of acceptance, we don't know. What we do know is that 30 years later, after Hirohito had died in 1989, who knew that he had lived so long? It's quite incredible. It's 19 years ago that he died. This man who had been, for most of his life, a god. In 1989, he died, and Akihito became emperor, and Michiko Shoda, this girl who came from Tokyo, became empress. And then in 1993, but a few years before that was when they got married. A few years before that, her son, around the same time she became empress, fell madly in love with the most dynamic career woman of his generation, Masako Owada, who in fact was 2 years ahead of me at Harvard, though I didn't know her. She had grown up all over the world, spoke 5 or 6 languages. Her father was a very prominent and powerful diplomat. She worked for the foreign ministry at the time that he met her, and was considered likely to become the first female head of the foreign ministry, something that was absolutely unheard of, even in the empress's day. So this is a woman who in some ways, perhaps in a contemporary sense, was a kind of echo of the woman a generation before her, the woman who is now the empress. That woman, Masako Owada, rejected the crown prince 3 times in about as many years. A very, very difficult thing to do. Until the point where he finally said to his family and to the Imperial Household Agency, which is the 1,100 bureaucrats who had replaced the nobles as the people who run every word and every action of the members of the imperial family, that he had said to all of them that, in fact, if he could not marry her, he would marry nobody, thus ending 1,600 years of the imperial line and putting an immense amount of pressure on one woman, who finally said yes. Again, we don't know exactly why. There were rumors of a number of things, and we don't know exactly why. One of the rumors is that the empress had a private meeting with the crown princess and may have perhaps offered to protect her in some fashion, a promise that she either could not, well, she could not, and perhaps would not follow up on. Who knows? At any rate, she accepted in 1993, married, did not get pregnant for 8 years. Finally, in 2001, through artificial means, gave birth to a girl, not a boy. And from that moment on, basically has suffered one breakdown, a kind of breakdown or another, and has hardly been seen in public for almost 4 years. At the age of 44, in many ways, I think it's safe to say that her life is sort of over. The Empress herself, now in her 70s, I read something in the Times about 10 months ago saying that she had had to cancel a long planned trip because she'd been found to be bleeding from the nose, the mouth, and internally due to stress. Obviously another kind of breakdown, 40 years after whatever she recovered from in the 60s. Final note about changes in history. The Crown Prince in real life has a younger brother he and his wife had had 2 little girls early on. Everybody had girls, nobody had boys. And he had said quite definitively that they were not going to have any more children. A couple of years ago, whether it's due to the sheer pressure of the situation or fraternal rivalry or what is it, they got pregnant again through whatever means and gave birth a year and a half ago to a boy, thus ending any pressure on the Diet, the Japanese parliament, to change the laws, which looked like they were going to have to do, to allow the little girl to one day rule, and basically freezing in time and place all the women in this imperial family in the exact same situation that they now find themselves in for another 75 years. So where's the drama in all this, you might ask? Understandably, since it would seem simply to be a continuum of depressing facts. I'll tell you 3 things that made me want to write this book. And I'm not a royal watcher or royal fanatic. The Princess Di thing mostly missed me, I'm sorry to say. I'm not without sympathy, but it just wasn't that interesting to me in many ways. This story struck me because for a couple of reasons, and they're fairly fundamental. One is, as I mentioned before, the idea simply of a young woman or anybody who had a normal childhood, who did not foresee in any fashion throughout those years and the memories that are accruing and the experiences that are being born, that at some future date, age of 24, she would cross over the moat that surrounds the 240 acres of Imperial Palace in the center of Tokyo, actual moat with the big tall walls behind it, that she would cross over that moat and effectively disappear. That from that moment on, all the life essentially that she would have was the life that she had brought with her, like a series of trunks that contained her memories, and that was it. And that what appeared to be a choice, however difficult the choice was, and it wasn't easy, because they did have some sense, definitely, that they were entering, she and her parents, that she was being sent into a world that she was not prepared for. In fact, at first, she actually turned the Crown Prince down, saying that she was not worthy. But it still was a choice. But then you get across on the other side, and you discover that what had appeared to be a choice is in fact no such choice. That what appeared to be a horizon is in fact not a horizon at all. That everything is fixed. Every single thing is locked down, and every single thing is exactly the way it always was, and that you are expected to enter this landscape and become it, and there will be no other movement. That the weight of history falls down upon you and flattens you, because that's what it's supposed to do. And in order to do that, it must deny your humanity and your individuality at every turn. So it is, in fact, akin, I think, to walking along and then suddenly falling down a well that's about 5,000 feet deep. At the bottom of the well is this world, as I have just described it. And you're down there in the dark, trying to find your way, trying to persist in any fashion. While up on the surface, your image is still being beamed. It's like your holograph that's up there, because you're down here. And that holograph is wearing these quite remarkable robes that are not yours, and speaking words that you never invented, but that have been here before, long before you, and performing actions that have nothing whatsoever to do with you. And that all of these words and actions and robes have been the same for centuries upon centuries. And there you are down there. But this gets to the second thing that made me want to write the book, and that is 30 years later, your son falls in love with this woman who in some way, in a contemporary sense, reminds you of yourself. And there she is up there in the free world. And at a certain point, you see that she is not going to come down. But you may want her to come down for your own reasons. You may want her to come down because your son has staked his entire happiness upon it. And you may want her to come down because you have been down there yourself alone for more than 30 years with no one to talk to and no one to understand you. Whatever the case, you reach out to her, and perhaps you do offer to protect her in some fashion. Perhaps you do meet her. And who knows to what degree you have persuaded her, but she does come down. She marries, she comes down. And then you watch as, in the succeeding years, she is broken down to some level far worse than ever happened to you. She's not as strong as you, though she seemed at first stronger. And then eventually she gives birth, and it's not a boy, but it's another girl. And you must at some point ask yourself, as yet another generation of women comes along, how long you can allow this to go on. And this gets to the final thing, reason that I wanted to write this book, which is that there aren't that many perks in the novel writing business, to be quite honest. They take a long time. It's very slow, lonely. It's rather hard. But you get to write your own ending. It's definitely one of the perks. And the more I thought about this subject, the more I learned about the world, this world as it was, the more utterly unacceptable it seemed to me. Not that where we are now historically is an ending, but that it doesn't seem to be anything else. It's not a beginning. It's hardly even a continuum. It is a state, it's sort of an end of existence, if you will. It seemed utterly unacceptable to me, both humanly, in that all the humanity of the people involved has been denied relentlessly throughout the centuries and the decades, and also narratively, in that there is nothing organic about where things stand now. And as a novelist, I am looking for an ending to any of my books. I'm looking for an organic ending, an ending that grows organically from the story that you have just read. Not an ending that I came up with 4 years before I wrote the book and thought was really smart, but an ending that where you throw all of that out of the way and you get to this point and you have to say to yourself, what is the true ending for this book that has just happened, this story, these characters? It has to grow out of who they are and how they have been. And there is no such thing in this situation in real life in the imperial family, because it has all been denied them. Narratively, humanly, it has been flattened. And that's unacceptable to me, and so I wrote my own ending, which departs quite radically from history. But that's one of the perks. So I'm going to just read two little sections from the book. I'm focusing here on her crossing over. That's what I've been talking about. And the first section is literally the morning she leaves her house for the first time with the world watching to go to the palace to be married. What do you need to know? Mrs. Oshima is her chief lady-in-waiting, imposed upon her by the empress, and certainly one of the empress's people in every fashion. Miko is the childhood friend of the empress, and on and off again, the great friend of her life in certain ways. And Kenji was Miko's younger brother, and he was horribly burned and disfigured in the War of 1945. But he reappears later as well. I'm going to have to call upon your strongest imaginations to imagine that I am, in fact, wearing one of these and not what I'm wearing, and that I do not speak with a nasal monotone, but with a lilting, feminine Japanese accent, etc. I bowed to my parents and left them. In the first of two large automobiles, deep maroon with the imperial crest, I was driven down the narrow street on which I had lived for most of my life. Through the faintly darkened windows, I waved to the people gathered along the way, here and there recognizing faces that seemed to have aged a dozen years since I had last seen them. Reaching the main avenue, we turned in the direction of the palace, our police escort pulling alongside to form a caravan. I held on tightly to the door handle to keep myself from trembling. Mrs. Oshima, seated on the jump seat with drawn-together knees, regarded me with thin-lipped suspicion. It was an expression that in time I would come to know better. "You must bear yourself with greater control," she said. "Of course, you are right, Oshima-san. I will try harder. And before the cameras, you must not allow your head to droop in that coarse manner." Forgive me, I was not aware. Evidently not. In the newspapers tomorrow, the photographs will prove what I am saying to you. I have no doubt. Her Majesty will share my opinion. I stared out the window at my neighborhood, reeling into the past, twin feelings of helplessness and terror patrolling my shoulders like two sharp-beaked crows. They knew me by sight and could attack at will. There could be no outrunning them. It seemed incredible to me, I will not deny it, that the roads in which I had innocently walked as a child, however incidental, had somehow led me to this morning, gliding through the streets of my home city toward a country at once closer and more unknown than any I had yet encountered, on a journey that, if I were not to fail utterly, must be for life. At that early hour, with few people about, the streets appeared like mouths waiting to break into smiles. Wherever I looked, I saw flags and paper cherry blossoms adorning doorways, lamp-posts, subway signs, parked cars, bicycles. From shop windows everywhere, blown up, beribboned photographs of His Highness and me in formal attire or tennis clothes stared out unblinking. Only after the car, with its smoothly oiled machinery, had carried me by did I recognize in those framed and cropped images two people of my intimate knowledge. All the while, owl-like, Mrs. Oshima was hunting me from her perch on the jump seat, the raised and demonstrative angle of her chin declaring her condemnation of my performance in those ubiquitous photographs, as well as her personal indignation. How wrong it was, how unnatural that a mere commoner should be thus raised above her in the hierarchy. My comportment would not do, it would not do at all. One click of her steel shutter, one stamp of her family's noble seal would capture me for all posterity. I would be exposed. There was nothing to do then but set my own chin, release the door handle from its death grip, and turn away from my keeper. The frozen smile on my face, not for her but for the unseen television cameras set up along our route. If His Highness, watching at home, happened to catch sight of me in the back of the car, I would give him no cause for worry. Closer to our destination, one began to see more people in the streets. Later, during the imperial procession following the marriage ceremony, there would be many occasions for commerce, and those who hoped to profit were stirring now, already establishing their carts and wares for the crowds to come. Taxicab drivers, pedicab pullers, women tying bunches of flowers and sticks of incense, a man in a pointed bamboo hat pushing wooden skewers through squid. With my motorcade some distance away, they would still be going about their preparations with habitual skill, memories alive in the rote muscular actions of hands and feet. And I envied them, I confess. Their mornings of labor and industry, difficult as they no doubt were, yet continual and routine, days without end. And then, over Mrs. Oshima's shoulder, one by one through the windshield, I watched the awareness of my approach dawn like the sun on these good citizens. The police, my motorcade, the imperial crest. I watched heads turn and hands fall useless. In the air, that dense stillness which swallows sound. And, as my car came abreast of them, I watched my future subjects drop to their knees on the pavement as though struck down in battle. Their reverent backs, my final glimpse of the jumbled, striving, visceral world with which, I suddenly understood, I had never been well enough acquainted. I looked away. Mrs. Oshima did not pass up the opportunity of catching my eye. When we arrive, you understand, there will be no time for sightseeing, she informed me. Along the wide, curving moat surrounding the palace, rows of cherry trees announced the end of their seasonal beauty. Some of the trees were weeping, blossoms in white and palest pink, ponderous with decrepitude, eddying on the brown water, stirred by the paddling of ducks. Beyond the moat were the massive walls of gray stone, the tiled rooftops of guard towers. At the double bridge, our motorcade slowed to a halt. We were waved across to enter the palace grounds. There, too, blossoms littered the edges of paths and lay windswept where they'd fallen. The house of bamboo had been built for the crown prince's two sisters, though only Princess Midori, the younger and unmarried sister, still lived there. I had met her several times during the winter, slim and pretty, with an oval face and small aristocratic hands, fond of orchids and cormorant fishing and the movies of Doris Day. I did not see her that morning, or anyone else from her family. My ladies-in-waiting met me at the entrance to the house and immediately herded me upstairs to a private chamber. The spacious, elegantly furnished room in which I was to be purified and dressed in the 12-layer costume was cool and faintly damp from the night. A chill was in the air as the women began to undress me. Tiny bumps rose on my naked arms and breasts, and my nipples, to my mortification, grew prominent. I remembered being with Miko and her family in Hakone one winter holiday before the war. In a bathhouse beset with frigid drafts, we'd pointed in giggling disgust at her mother's dark, furiously erect nipples. Edamame, we'd called them, never imagining that one day we might involuntarily produce our own. And now that my own time had come, physically exposed like this, my mind couldn't quite grasp the horror. I was stripped naked, my arms positioned like a mannequin. During the anxious months of preparations for the wedding, I had lost too much weight and was only too aware now of the jutting planes of my hips and pelvis, the earthly disappointments of my corporeal self. I stood gazing into the stone basin of purification water, trying not to weep. Respectfully, Haruko-sama, we must begin, Mrs. Oshima said. I looked up at her, her face a mask of imperial propriety. And so, at least, the situation between us was clear enough. In her public language to me, she would be dutiful and correct, while in private she would speak more critically for the empress and their kind. I reached for the stone dipper. I scooped the warm water over my body, felt it splash and soothe my chilled skin. The warm, clean water ran down my legs to the floor. For generations, empresses and princesses had purified themselves in this manner. Briefly closing my eyes, I received the sanctity of their collective awareness. A sense not so much of welcome or sisterhood, never had I felt more alone, but of an intricate web of ancient history, invisible to the outside world yet unbreakable, to which the thread of my destiny was about to be irrevocably joined. Over the white padded silk kimono, a magenta skirt, Then the Nagabakama pleated and divided, falling to the floor. Then, in succession, 5 unlined silk robes, their gaping, elaborately bordered sleeves, each shorter than the one preceding. Next, a long kimono of exquisitely embroidered crimson silk, followed by a kimono jacket, hip length, of embroidered violet silk. Finally, the train, a pale sea green, laced with intricate patterns. Before Lady Nijo, before even the time of Genji, this was how women of the court had dressed in ceremony. I would be no different. Like theirs, my hair was molded with a viscous pomade into a wide, heart-shaped frame, a black winged halo for my whitened face. Pressing painfully on my forehead was a 3-pronged golden ornament. At my breast, half hidden among the deep folds of silk, I held a bouquet of special handmade paper. This was not my first time. There had been rehearsals for both hair and clothes. Such aspects of tradition could not be left to chance or to my own ineptitude. Awkward as a foal's, my feet had been trained over weeks to master the necessary childlike steps under the silken tent of robes. Forward and backward, forward and backward. A harsh discipline with its pain and punishments, its small terrors in the dark. One would be able to travel no great distance under such restrictive conditions. I was to discover, though, that one could yet go far enough to disappear. So, she gets hitched, basically. Just a little backyard ceremony, a little barbecue. You get the picture. There is, after the wedding, I'm going to spare you the description of the wedding, there is a procession through the streets of Tokyo, 2.5 miles to the Crown Prince's residence. They are riding in an open carriage, basically a replica of a 19th century English carriage with crystal lanterns off the corners of the carriage, velvet inside, behind, rows of guards in peaked hats like 19th century British admirals. I mean, you can't imagine the pomp, the circumstance. And then tens and tens of thousands of people from all over Japan lining the streets along the way. And to give you one little detail that maybe suggests the scene better than any other, you would expect that they would have been yelling, screaming. And they are, in fact, saying, bonsai, bonsai, and all these things. But it sounds as if they're whispering because they've been told not to startle the horses. This is about 3/4 of the way through the procession. Colored pennants and blown-up photographs of our likenesses twitched in the breeze, and puppets made in our image danced atop waving arms. Flags and balloons and dogs with ribbons tied round their necks, old women grilling yakitori, peasants in heavy trousers and round straw hats, school children in dark blue suits, and rows of uniformed veterans in wheelchairs, war medals gleaming on their chests, their heads bent over the cloth-covered remnants of their amputated limbs. Our horses turned a corner onto a new street, and our carriage followed obediently. The crowds behind the police lines turned with us, never leaving our sides, the river flowing onward, infinite. We smiled and waved, as we always must. In the crowd to our right, a mother was holding her infant girl, dressed like a cherry blossom, straight above her head, short, crooked legs kicking, so that His Highness might notice her child above all others. Dutifully, my husband waved and smiled. His face then was a mask, and so was my own face a mask. I could feel it resting there obscurely, heavily, across my cheekbones and nose, holding together my practiced smile and astonished eyes, making me a picture to the world and myself. We rode on. The procession took a long time. It was historic, every moment intended for posterity, though we were still living it. And so the life I had left behind began to disappear from the world. It was then on the final leg of our route, looking out into the crowd and expecting to see only the vast blank face of the masses, that I happened to catch sight of an old friend from my previous life. I had not seen Kenji Kuroda, Miko's brother, in years. a young man incongruously wearing now, in the early April sunshine, a heavy winter coat. The padded cotton hood fitted snugly over his head, like a thinly stuffed chick fallen out of a tree. The hood an attempt, one had to suppose, to keep insulated his smoothly barren face, which was missing an ear and several layers of skin. It was a face still eerily the same as the picture in my mind, stripped of the requisite layers of protection that might normally allow such a man to wait for hours among so many strangers, their diseases, their staring eyes, to catch for a single minute a view of the imperial couple, the crown prince and princess, the latter especially, an old dear friend of his sister's, the formerly Misora Hibari-obsessed teenager on whom he'd once bestowed, with no explanation, a white peony, mysteriously procured. Kenji was a painter, Miko had told me in her letters. He still lived at home and rarely ventured out. He had staked out a position for himself in the first row of onlookers on a street corner, wrapped in his padded coat like a bundle of wheat in a peasant's furoshiki, his narrow chest squared bravely up against the police line. Of course, he was taller than I remembered, a grown man with a grown man's features half wiped away, as though by a child's eraser. He wore his painful strangeness like his unseasonable coat and his skin lost to fire, as a flag not of suffering, but of distinction. He said not a word as we passed in the carriage, and my husband took no notice of him. But as we made the turn and pulled even with his position, Kenji ducked nimbly in front of the police line, pulling his hands from his pockets and raising his arms above his head, palms facing the sky, as though basking in the unfamiliar sun. That was his gesture in its entirety. One could see that his left hand was missing 2 fingers. He never took his eyes from my face. By then I had acknowledged him. I smiled and waved, overcome with the happy astonishment of seeing him again. Over the years, if I thought about him at all, I had assumed him to be a sort of prehistoric case, frozen in time, another lost victim of the war. It seemed inconceivable that he should have surfaced on this day. Yet here he was, palms raised to the sky, his naked gaze like a voice stripped of lies, compelling me to speak for once with equal conviction. And I almost did. I almost said something, looking down on him from my moving carriage of unsurpassed elegance. Some wishful phrase, sincere and true, I consoled myself by believing. Some sentiment of timeless resonance, heart, delicacy, rippling circles of association. Some part of myself never to be relinquished or forgotten. Yes, I almost called out to him, to his courage and his love, his blazing disfigurement, his unrequited longing burning holes in his palms, until I remembered who I had just become and stopped myself. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have a little time for some questions, if anybody has any. It's not required, but happy to answer any. Yes? They met, the paparazzi in Japan are pretty well controlled, to say the least. I happen to live a block from Heath Ledger's old house, so I can tell you that from recent evidence. They met on a tennis court, rather like the book describes it. I can't tell you what they were thinking or feeling. But the court was set aside privately. Everything was arranged so as not to draw too much attention. But the Crown Prince moved among a circle. All of his friends, as he had, went to the Peers School, which is a school for the noble families. And all of the brides until this empress, and all the women who had been considered as his potential bride until he chose this empress, had been graduates of the Peeresses School. This was how it was meant to be. The Crown Princess, at that time, Michiko Shoda, had gone to Sacred Heart University, and they had met through they had mutual friends. She was a good tennis player. She beat him. And eventually he became quite interested in her. And then a great deal of discussion had to go on about the revolutionary nature of the fact that she was a commoner, however privileged. And this went on right up until she was married. It would seem that the current empress at the time and everyone within the court was not persuaded by the argument. But the crown prince seemed genuinely to love her, and they got married. But that's how they met. Yes? I'll answer the second question first. Well, it's not up to me to translate it. I've gotten a bunch of offers for I have a bunch of foreign publishers. The Japanese are not going to be in line to translate this book, I'm quite sure, based largely on simply months ago my foreign literary agent described for me just the expression on the face of the Japanese literary agent when she told him what the story was about. He blanched and ran in the other direction. Essentially, they don't want anything to do with this book. It is a deeply sympathetic portrait, which already may not necessarily be something that they want in one sense, because it's a sympathetic portrait of two women particularly. But in any event, it is a Western act of sympathy, not an Eastern act of sympathy. This act of sympathy does not exist in the East as such. It would be considered incredibly arrogant, if not almost blasphemous in a sense, to assume that you might know what any of these people ever felt or thought. No book like this has ever been written in modern history, no novel, piece of fiction like that. The only thing by anybody, let alone a guy named Schwartz who lives in Brooklyn. And the only thing that I'm aware of was a story in 1960 that was published in a small literary journal by a well-known Japanese writer at the time. It was meant to be satirical, I'm pretty sure, but he may have misjudged the audience a little bit. In the story, the narrator has a dream in which most of the members of the imperial family are beheaded. So a few months later, after the story came out, one member of the very strong ultra-rightist faction that exists, certainly still exists today, people who believe that if the emperor is not still in fact a god, he should be treated like one, and that the old ways were the best ways, and that everything that's happened since has been a traitorous dilution. One of these guys broke into the magazine publisher's house with a samurai sword. He wasn't around, so they killed the maid and grievously wounded his wife. And the publisher and the writer went into exile, and the writer never published again. I, of course, being American, am just desperate enough for sales, and I'm thinking, a samurai sword in the chest, hey, what could be better? You know, there's publicity for you. But, we haven't gotten that far, and I'm wearing Kevlar, of course. So that's that question. I don't think they're going to publish it. I think it's going to have a very vigorous and controversial life on Amazon Japan. And, in fact, just a week ago, I was in New York, and a bookstore owner came up to me and said that just in the past few days, several Japanese tourists had come up to the desk at the bookstore and in a whispered voice, as though they were ordering drugs under the counter, said, "Do you have that book about the..." And she held up my book, and they nodded, and they bought it, and they put it in their bags and walked away. So I'm hoping there'll be a lot of that. The first question was about what their actual lives are like. I think, like most of the people in their position, except more so, their lives are extremely boring. One reads very little, even in Japan, of the fact that the emperor spends on about 130 days a year, he oversees some form of Shinto ritual. This is not much discussed in Japan. They get up about 4:30. They have almost no time to themselves. They do not in any way lead nearly as lavish a life as the House of Windsor or almost any other royal family. Most of their wealth was taken away during the war or at the end of the war. And there was an article in the Times just a few days ago, a little thing talking about how many courses the Crown Princess had eaten at a Mexican dinner. And everybody in Japan is complaining that with a recession on and the economy is so bad that she is being too lavish. This is something you often hear in Japan. They're not meant to spend much money, and they don't have that much money, really, although they're obviously not poor. I mean, I think the big difference between the House of Windsor, let's say, and Princess Di and all that, and these people, is that these people taking the Empress, they're squashed to such a degree and flattened that we're not meant to, nor can we really, connect them with ourselves. We're not meant to see the similarities and feel their humanness. That would disarm the whole institution. It would rob it of its symbolic power. Princess Di, the reason that she is remembered largely is because so many people, when she was at her best, that people saw themselves in her to some degree, strange as that may sound. But it was the very human identification that made that particular thing work, and that also threatened the older members of that monarchy. But this is the difference, and it's a difference of culture as well and of history. Yeah. Two more questions. Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering about your background and your research areas, whether you were Japanese studies, studying Japan, there, obviously.
Yeah, you found me out. I was a Japanese studies major at Harvard. And I lived in Tokyo when I was 21 for about 5 months. You know, I was left in May and came back in September, and I worked for an American company, an experience that can generally be found in my first novel, Bicycle Days, which is about a young American who goes to Japan, believing that he can find a new home and a new life for himself and a new self, sort of running away from his past, finding, of course, that is not possible. And I went back to Harvard and persuaded them to let me write fiction for my thesis, which they had not done. They did. That became the beginnings of Bicycle Days, which was published when I was 24. Became a big bestseller, and it took me about 5 years to recover from that. Then I spent almost 6 years on Reservation Road, and I've been writing ever since. I really had nothing to do with Japan again, except continuing to read articles and see some friends and whatnot, until the mid-'90s, when I was certainly aware. I didn't go back to Japan really until 3 years ago, but I was aware in the mid-'90s that Crown Princess had married, of course. My great aunt had a private lunch alone with the Empress. It's a long story as to how that happened, but she came back telling me things about her incredible, almost desperate curiosity about my aunt's own life, my aunt being an older woman who had lived a very independent and successful life, publishing children's books, not having children, marrying late, traveling, kind of the antithesis, if you will, of the Empress's situation. She told me about that, and it made me think about how an imagination was still somehow alive in there. I went on and finished Reservation Road, wrote Claire Marvel, and then I began thinking about this and some of the things I talked about before. And I went back to Japan to do research about 3 years ago. Of course, I didn't really get any information because, doing research in Japan, I did 3 or 4 months of reading pretty much everything there was in English on the web and in books, mostly used books that aren't in print anymore. And then you get to a point, rather like the moat itself, you get to the moat beyond which only a handful of people know anything about this world, really, and they'll never talk. And press conferences and all that, it doesn't do anything because, it's just all fake, essentially. So I did arrange to have lunch with the Grand Chamberlain to the Emperor, took all of my contacts, and my journalist friends in Tokyo could not believe that he was meeting with me. They had never been alone with him in any fashion. He's the second or third ranking person in the Imperial Household Agency. I know for a fact that he didn't show up simply because he was a fan of my books that had been translated into Japanese. He showed up because he knew he had heard what I was doing, and I think he wanted to see for himself what sort of person I was and what this was about. So we had a lunch, and at the end he was very nice, and he offered to help me in any way he could. That was very nice of him, and I smiled, and I kind of, said, well, really what I'd like to know is the color of the carpets. And he smiled. He thought that was funny, and we had a little moment smiling, and then he never answered. So that was pretty much the iconic moment about doing research over there. The next day I had a 4-hour lunch with one of the Empress's best friends, someone she went to school with. By then I knew not to ask any questions at all. It was a really nice lunch, and I simply was trying to let her know what I was doing, that I was not interested in gossip whatsoever, that I had genuine literary interest in what I was doing and my reasons for doing so. To my shock, it turned out that she had shown my letter of introduction to the Empress, and they had discussed me in advance and decided that the friend would meet with me. 6 months later, through the friend, I received a book from the Empress. This is sort of interesting. The book didn't tell me anything I didn't know already. It was a compilation of press conferences of hers and 2 speeches that she'd given. I'd gotten all that off the web. But the fact that she sent it is interesting. Still sort of chewing on that. At any rate, it's my interest in Japan. I'm not in love with the culture anymore, but that allowed me to write a book about people who are maybe not in love with the culture anymore. But I don't feel the need to be in love with the culture to be interested in it. What strikes me as interesting at this point is that usually when I finish a book, you have a very strong relationship with it, but it doesn't elicit any particular images or anything of that sort. This book, I have a very particular thing that I want coming out of this book. It's something. It's like it's an image that comes out of it. And it's an image of desperately wanting to be a fly on the wall of 2 private rooms in the Imperial Palace. One is the Empress's private room, and the other one is the Crown Prince's private room. And I would give anything to simply watch them reading this book